All right. So, hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Method Made podcast. Today, I'm joined with Akshay. Akshay, I'm happy to have you here to share the MSAT perspective on tech transfer. So, welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I feel that these are kind of topics that don't really get discussed a lot. So I'm pretty happy that you're kind of engaging these conversations and we're kind of getting to expose and kind of share our experiences with these kind of things. So yeah, I'm pretty happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, yeah. For those of you who don't know Akshay, Akshay, you have experience at the sort of MSAT level in cell and gene therapy, and in MSAT, you're sort of sitting. My understanding is you're sort of sitting at the interface between GMP manufacturing and R&D procedures. So you must sort of have a very clear picture of these sorts of documentation challenges.
Oh yeah. So I've been in this industry for around 10 years. I've had I actually started off my career in a cell and gene therapy company.
Mhm.
Uh, it was RNA silencing. This was a decade ago, right? So it was fairly new. It didn't go too far, but I did learn a lot through that process. And as I grew, I got into process development, and I worked with generics and various novel monoclonal antibodies, and that sort of introduced me into R&D, in particular process development. And we worked in a system that sort of aligned with our manufacturing sites.
Mhm.
In fact, our labs were pretty much a scaled down version of what you would see in a manufacturing site. And being my first job, I did not realize the lengths at which the company went to sort of make us do R&D in a GMP manner. So I did sort of do a lot of process characterization initially, and that's kind of referred to late stage development for these molecules, and then kind of did some early stage development where I did clone selections, as well as understanding how to scale up new processes in larger batches. Once I came to Canada, I kind of started working my way into the GMP environment. So I started off in an organization which had a very ambitious project to kind of set up a facility for COVID vaccines, and a very ambitious timeline. So that kind of really fast tracked my experience with what was required in a GMP environment. So yeah, I think at this point I have returned to cell and gene therapy with these kind of experiences, and I've learned a lot. And I think I've seen how different and dynamic cell and gene therapies can be to your traditional therapies. Yeah.
Wow, that's a wealth of experience you have, and yeah, the experience you mentioned about the sort of the R&D environment that was a scale down of a GMP environment. I'm starting to learn, the value of that, and that seems to be not particularly common. Like a lot of what I'm seeing in the R&D, it's like academic spin out, and there seems to be that sort of chasm between there and GMP manufacturing a lot of the time.
Yeah. I can only speak about my experiences, and when I did start working in an R&D lab, and I had that environment that I talked about, where it was pretty much scaled down of the GMP environment, and I mean to the extent where we gowned into our labs,
Mhm.
not just the lab coat, get the street clothes covered up, and then perform your experiments in that kind of manner, and have a robust documentation procedure as well in that
Mhm.
environment where we had to issue a batch records. These are not things you typically see in organizations.
Mhm.
And coming out of it and looking at other R&D organizations and how they operated, I was so surprised because I had a benchmark, right? My experience was, okay, this is how things are usually conducted. And then when I came and I explored other organizations and how they operated, I was so surprised. I was so surprised to see how much more laid back it was. It does allow for a lot more freedom and a lot more ability to kind of test various things.
Mhm.
But then there is a bit of, as you said, the chasm, right? There's a bit of missing information that happens when you don't sort of have that robust structure in place. So I kind of see the advantages and disadvantages, and I do think that the more you align yourself to GMP, the less complications you're going to see for your process as you go down um, the development, stream of for that molecule. Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense. So you have experience both with a small molecule and cell and gene. Something I'm seeing is sort of unique about the challenges, especially the timelines for cell and gene, is sort of vein to vein delivery. So, if we compare it to a generic, you might be producing a huge batch that is not under particularly strict timelines. For cell and gene therapy, you're taking cells from someone, engineering them, and delivering them back. So how does that sort of impact that sort of timelines, for instance, to get from R&D through process development and then manufacturing?
Uh, I think when I got back into cell and gene therapy after sort of having a lot of experience with your common molecules, your antibodies, larger protein molecules, etc. What I learned is that there is a lot of adaptability you need to have in the cell and gene space. There are a lot more controls when it comes to your traditional medicines. You probably work with monoclonal clones of various cell lines where you see very little variability, right? You can control your process end to end. But when you work with cell and gene therapy, sometimes you don't have the freedom to work with cells which are pretty much the same. And if you're working with patient cells, as you mentioned, right? We're talking about autologous versus allogenic therapies. So allogenic therapies, you're taking it from the patient. It tends to get much more challenging and less controlled, right?
With the allogenic one.
Yeah, exactly,
Okay.
right? And especially with CAR T cell therapies, um, when they're being administered to patients, they're being administered to patients with late stage cancer,
Yeah.
right? So you're working with patients who don't have the healthier cells. So again, you're being introduced to a set of cells that have a probability of not working the way that you had developed your process, right? Because of some unseen challenges that only experience can kind of guide you towards. And that environment kind of enforces you to adapt as you go. And that's the major difference, I would say, like from your traditional therapies to what kind of therapies are being developed in the cell and gene therapy space. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So what you just described there, the lack of health of patient cells, that sort of makes me think about another aspect of the difference between R&D and sort of real production, which is R&D in science that happens in a perfectly controlled environment under ideal circumstances. So, I'm sure many of these papers published, they are with ideal cells, and what you actually work with in the real world are not necessarily that. So I'd love to kind of get back into this sort of maybe the mindset clash between R&D discovery and the sort of level of consistency you need for GMP.
Yeah. Um, there is definitely a bridge, and I think coming from the experience of having worked in both process development and in commercial manufacturing, you kind of see a drift where in commercial manufacturing, you do want to deliver into your drugs in a safe manner, potentially into patients, right? So there is that additional risk of sort of guidance and regulatory needs to manufacture this product safely, where you collect data, you study everything. Any mistake goes wrong, you need to know how to investigate it. You need to show that confidence that you understand your process in and out in such a manner that if you do have a failure, you can justify why it may not be a risk or justify why it needs to be kind of discarded and kind of restarted again with a new batch. And sometimes that's a very, very expensive mistake, especially if your patients aren't that healthy and you don't have the opportunity to create another batch of, let's say, CAR T cell therapies in those instances, right? In an R&D environment, your job essentially is to generate data. Um, it sort of has less guidance towards what your end goal is, and that might be organization to organization how you design your R&D team to function. Sometimes you might have the insight of understanding that yes, I want to take this drug from my lab all the way to someone's bench top.
Mhm.
So I have to have those things put into place. I want those kind of experiments that generates data that will help manufacturing investigate as to why things go wrong. But in an R&D environment, sometimes that insight is not there when you perform these experiments. Sometimes if an experiment's not going too well, you kind of ad hoc it and kind of um, make fixes on the go, and you might miss out on a little bit of information.
Mhm.
And another complication that comes is if you don't understand what you're supposed to deliver to an MSAT scientist or to the manufacturing site as an R&D scientist, you might not provide the guidance that they or the data sets that they would need, right? You might not record some things that you would considered not critical to characterizing your process, but it might be a clue as to what has gone wrong in your process during a manufacturing batch. So if I don't get that data, I don't have any historic data to kind of understand what's going wrong and how do I fix it today before it gets completely discarded, right?
That's something I would love to sort of dive into is like, so it sounds sort of like the context. It's sometimes it sounds like when you get R&D data into a process lab, if it's missing this sorts of information, you don't necessarily have the context you need to make the informed decisions. What are some types, like what would be, I don't know if you can share what some of the types of that data might be, like.
It okay. I'll kind of I'll try and talk about an example I saw. We and this might dwell into another topic, which would be more to do with how do you um, what do you put down in tech transfer document essentially,
Yes,
so
yes.
that so that your manufacturing your MSAT scientists can write a batch record and ensure that your process is being executed in the manner that it has been developed, right?
Mhm.
So the example I want to introduce is one where the client wanted us to, um, in a bioreactor, introduce plasmids in a manner that sort of gently, uh, in a manner that the plasmids were gently received by the culture itself, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And when you're working with single-use bioreactors, you have only feeding ports that are sort of dropped in, and
Hmm.
you don't necessarily always have a dipping port, which will sort of gently introduce a solution into the reactor.
I see.
So the language they used was gently introduce the plasmids. We executed it. We saw issues.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the way that we took it is okay, perhaps we can pump it at a slower rate and
Yeah.
kind of control that manner, right? They
Yeah.
didn't provide that information,
Hmm.
but we made that presumption on our end, right? They didn't sort of classify the rate at which you pump your reagent with, right? And sometimes you don't want to even specify things like that because if you do specify it and then you classify it as a critical process parameter, then you have to control it very well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you tend to understand what should be placed and not placed. And in this instance, what they wanted us to do is sort of introduce the plasmid in a manner that kind of allowed you to let the plasmids drip on the wall of the bag into the solution. And
Wow.
that sort of was a gentle way of introducing the plasmid. So again, in an R&D lab, you can perhaps execute that in some manner, but
Hmm.
when you um, when you do it in GMP, to word it out in a batch record, to put it in an SOP, to ensure that someone executes it that way, those are where you're going to see a bit of a gap between what an R&D team would do versus a GMP team.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, hearing that story, it sounds like from the process development side, you were sort of looking for something quantitative, like a flow rate in that circumstance. And gently, it's funny, gently is one of these words that comes up in many of these conversations that shows up in SOPs.
Yeah.
And people in process development are like, how gently do you mean? And so, I think this is an illustrative example of
Yeah.
some of the sort of contextual information that's sometimes missing when you receive a protocol uh, that, as we discussed, is sort of developed by scientists in may just through the nature of science be developed in a bit of an ad hoc way, and you now have to transfer it into a process that is at a GMP environment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think this dwells into the importance of, how valuable various forms of instructions can be provided to various individuals, right? So you can write very well, you can put instructions down very well, you can have illustrations in your SOPs and MBR, but sometimes you need to have experience and you need to perhaps have better tools to help you learn, such as video SOPs, that will sort of help you understand um, better. It's so hard sometimes to put things into words, and sometimes it can get a bit too convoluted in the sense that if I'm trying to do it in a batch record, right? If I've decided I don't want to make a separate SOP for a particular step, I just want to put in my batch record. Um, and I start detailing out that step, it becomes a lot of information. And
Mhm.
if you have operators who continuously execute the same batches, they're kind of stuck with a very lengthy document, kind of describing things. Sometimes you want a reference to a video that simplifies it. You can cross-verify and you can check it, and it should be fine. And yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and because you're sort of balancing, with these instructions, you're balancing detail needed with sort of accessibility. Because if you're bombarded with information and you're suited up, you have a bag in your hand, that's just practically speaking, that is just not an ideal scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And nowadays you have also all the technologies in your clean rooms to sort of access various forms of what you call instructions, right? If it's an SOP in a digital form or in a video form, you'll have all of that to aid you to do those processes. So I think it's going to a place nowadays where you have all of that accessible to these operators to ensure that there are no mistakes conducted, or that every time a new operator comes in, they're executing the step in a very similar manner than the previous operator.
Well, that's a great segue. I'd love to discuss in sort of GMP environments, what are the current technologies that are getting implemented that are helping operators, to deal with this type of circumstance, like the one you mentioned earlier with the dripping. Yeah, how are new documentation technologies helping with that?
Uh, I, I again can only speak about my own experiences, and what I can tell you is that there isn't too much going on. In fact, even in my facility, I think I was one of the only few people who introduced a video SOP for the bioreactor, for instance, something like that. It's sort of a debate sometimes with companies with what is the minimum amount of things needed versus what is the best things to have for your operators or for anyone who's executing these processes, right? So yes, all you would need is a written document that clearly states how you do it. But if you have the time and the luxury to then or if you're seeing too many failures in relation to a particular process, that's when you have to start looking into it and start getting creative about how do I ensure that this is not going to be and I can tell one person what to do, but I want to make sure that when I leave this organization, someone else is running it and someone else is operating that clean room, they too get that insight or that missing information that perhaps cannot be captured in a document. So then you start looking at these tools, and be it SOP, video SOPs, or any other kind of tools, I think it is important. There's not enough done in this space, and there's definitely a lot that potentially can be implemented. So yeah.
Well, so you mentioned, when people move on and having the importance of documenting effectively for when that happens, and so something that I've sort of seen is this is a form of risk for thinking a little bit higher level, like at the organizational level. if you have developed a process and you have this tacit knowledge, maybe you have an SOP with the words of how you do it, of what you do. But if you just have the words of what you do and you don't have captured, for example, in the video, the exact, that gently we described earlier, that can just walk out the door with that personnel. So that seems to be like a pretty big business risk as well.
Absolutely. I think not a lot of people have that insight or the foresight for that. They tend to run their operations the way that they do because it makes sense for today and now. And then at some point, when people move on and you look at data that's been generated 5 years ago, how much can you really depend on it if it's not well documented, if it's just on Excel sheets, if it's not sort of signed off, or there's no quality review over those data sets? How much of it is reproducible, trusted? It doesn't have any hidden impacts during that execution that is not documented on these organs. There's too many things that makes the job so much harder to restart that project if you needed to restart it, and you don't have the people who worked on it originally, and if it's not documented properly. So it's definitely an issue I'm sure a lot of people have seen in this industry, and not enough companies do enough to kind of ensure that it gets carried forward to the next set of people who take on those kind of projects.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense. I'd love to just change directions a little bit here. So, we're talking a lot about SOPs, the need for capturing these details. So, what are the just on a more basic level? What are the consequences of poor documentation? Like, why do we need to do this? Because what actually goes wrong if these things are not effectively documented? What are the downstream consequences?
So, and can we put it in the context of, let's say, a tech transfer document between two different parties, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you are developing a process and you are going to a CDMO or CMO, and you want to execute that process in a larger scale, perhaps, right? And you have developed a process on your end to end, or perhaps taken up to 50 liters on your whatever your process is, and you want to take it into another facility that has developed a process that can scale it up to, let's say, 2,000 liters, right? What you have to ensure is that your data is one part robust, right? Your document, what you've been recording, is trustable data, right? If you're using various instruments to take offline readings of your samples, have them been calibrated? Are they trusted? Have are any verifications done in the day? Are we getting false numbers in any sense, right? Hopefully, you're not develop your whole process with a faulty equipment. I don't ever see that happening, but essentially, you don't want any data points to be misleading, because sometimes those odd data points will help you investigate a process as well. So you need to have those robust data sets with you. And another important thing is you need to have reproducibility of your process as well implemented. So I don't think just one experiment will help tell you that you have a developed process. Show to anyone, let's say 3 times at least, or 5 times, that if I run it with these exact conditions, then you're able to have this exact output. So my sort of advice or suggestion to anyone in process development is to understand who this data is going to go to and what they're trying to do with that data, right? And have absolutely no presumption that they have any background in what you do. And I feel like that's the best way to write. Just don't presume that they have any background in, let's say, whatever field you're in, and they're just someone who's pretty much receiving something foreign, and they have to, as you would have IK instructions, executed as per the instructions that you kind of laid out. So the best approach that you would want to do is to look at your attributes of your process. What is critical? What is controlling your process? What's not controlling your process? This is something you do in process characterization, which is much later. But if you start that practice early on, then you kind of align yourself to your end goal, right? Eventually you're going to look back at your R&D data to help you do your process characterization. And if you follow that pathway, you're also helping your manufacturers also execute the process as close as you can to to what you've done in your lab. Now, the other issue is your process tech transfer document is going to be a little skinny, right? You'll have perhaps a report. A report will give you a little more details, give you a little historic information as to how did you come to from A, how did you get to Z, right?
Mhm.
That'll give you information, and you'll have SOPs to provide. That's all great, but these are all little pieces of information that are not necessarily completely tied together, but will help you understand what you need to implement in a manufacturing site. And if you don't do enough of those steps properly in the first place, and you kind of just go to a CDMO and say, hey, one good batch, this is the settings I've used, can you run this on your facility? There's going to be a lot of back and forward between you and them, right? When it comes to how do I handle this buffer, how do I handle this reagent, what is the pump rate? Like, if you don't know what they're going to ask, they're going to come back to you with a lot of questions and and you're going to waste a lot of time in that process as well, that you hopefully would want to mitigate. And if you don't have that communication with your CDMO, you're just going to see a lot of failed batches. And if your process is expensive, again, that's a huge setback for you. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. So the way you're talking about this sort of, it sounds like you would advise starting this process development mindset as early as possible, including the documentation practices. And it sounds like it's sort of, that's a way to de-risk earlier than later, because these situations you're describing where there's a tech transfer into a CDMO and then back and forth communications, that seems to happen. What I'm hearing is that's happening when the process isn't very well characterized at that time, and so that's when it sort of surfaces and these back and forths happen to sort of patch that up. Is that sort of right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, you might be debated on as to why do I need to characterize my process today. It's such a robust process, right? You do a lot of studies, especially when you identify various things are critical to your process, right? So you have to also then study those. Sorry, I'm just going to keep my computer on charge. I can see it kind of low. So you kind of study those processes very in depth, and you would do that at you would probably do that only at your later stages of your process as well. So what do I mean by that? I mean, that process characterization is right before you do clinical trials 3 and right before you do commercial manufacturing. So why do I need to do it when I'm going for, pre-CTA? Why do I have to do it if I'm doing phase 1?
Mhm.
You don't. The answer is you don't need to do it for that. But you do need to start laying that pathway towards it, because essentially your goal is to get to that clinical trial 3 and your commercial manufacturing. So if you start that if you had a foresight and you implement those steps ahead of time, then you're pretty much de-risking, as you said, de-risking the whole process, and you're also making the job easier for your manufacturing side, because they hopefully would know that this is what I would need in order to reproduce your batch in a manner that is very consistent to what you're seeing, and we have no surprises, no failures, nothing goes out of spec, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, what's one thing I would like to sort of dive into as well, as we're sort of coming towards the end, is we've talked about video SOPs, capturing these nuances and details, and there's sort of two sides to this coin that I see. There's like the compliance and the training. So, yeah, it'd be great. I would love to hear your perspective a bit on the sort of differences on like SOPs that may be intended for for regulatory purposes, or if they're just for sort of like internal for training new employees. Are those the same documents? Do they have? Is there a different emphasis on them? Or yeah.
Mm. So I would say that SOPs are designed for two audiences, let's say three audiences, right? You have first the people who need to use it, right? uh, your operators, your R&D scientists, whoever needs to use it, right? They are your primary audience for your SOPs, right? So you have to make sure that you're writing in a manner that aids their needs first. Um, the second audience of an SOP is your quality team slash potential auditors, right? Their job is to ensure that the documents that are provided to these operators are sufficient um, to execute a particular process without failure, right? And their job is then to ensure that that SOP is covering all your topics, right? Sometimes it'll be a work instruction or an SOP specific to a process, be it specific to an equipment, how do you handle that equipment, when does it need to be calibrated. These are the things you would want your quality team to sort of come back to you and say, hey, this equipment, you hadn't identified that um, uh, it should be cleaned with particular reagents, or it needs to be calibrated annually, or it needs to be verified post every sample that's run on it. Those things need to be kind of covered by your quality assurance team as well. And those are the things that auditors will also look at is, okay, are they writing their SOPs in a manner that ensures that, not only does it provide instructions of how to operate it, but keep that equipment maintained and executing uh, samples or whatever it has to do in a manner that's reliable. So I would say when I write SOPs, my first approach is getting the language right for people who want to execute a particular process utilizing it. And second is also to make sure that all the quality, am I doing the right job? Am I ensuring that I've covered all the aspects that I need to cover to ensure that this equipment is going to be performing the way that it needs to perform? And it's similar when you go to batch records and any other kind of documentations in this space. It's not just one audience you're writing for. So ensure that when you do these documents, you're addressing everyone's needs, including you as a author.
Okay, so that's great to sort of understand who the actual stakeholders are in the SOP writing process. So, as we're wrapping up, I'd love to hear, just sort of on an ending note, if you're talking to companies that maybe at the sort of preclinical level, we've talked about the different standardization and sort of rigor of documentation needed at different levels of clinical trials. What sort of advice might you have for them as we sort of earlier discussed about de-risking towards their later stages? What would you sort of advise?
So when it comes to these particular documents, be it SOPs, MBRs, and maybe I'll turn my focus to batch records because this is a little more interesting uh, when it comes to how do you write it versus an SOP. SOPs are more or less standardized. You won't find too many differences from one organization to another. Sometimes you have work instructions or you have process-related SOPs. It's up to you, right? There's no rules. There's no formats established. You do it as you feel is the most appropriate way of implementing it or being it successful for whoever you're trying to write it for, right? So when it comes to batch record, that's also the same fact. There is no standard necessarily that you need to follow, but there are regulations set by the regulatory bodies of various countries that expect you to have XYZ things in these documents.
Mhm.
Apart from that, you have the freedom of writing your batch records the way that you want to write them. Being in a CDMO, I've seen batch records come from clients that vary so much from each other. Some are, they'll call themselves lean batch records, but they'll have they'll have a lot of instructions with them. And that's fine. A lean batch records going to only refer to SOPs. It doesn't mean that it's going to be less in length. But you also see very actually lean MBRs where they sort of only document the minimal amount of data that you would want to write onto the document. So do you like the weight check or what is the current temperature? Very minimal. When it comes to instructions of how to do this, go to the SOP. You'll find everything there. And you have a very stripped down MBR. Some operators like it, and they like it because they already know what to do, and all they have to do is put down information. Great. But I've been in a place where I received one of those MBRs and I have to implement that process in my facility. I have no idea what these SOPs are and how your particular equipments work. Sometimes I don't have the same equipments that you have.
Yeah.
So it's nice that I have your equipment's SOP, but for me to execute this in my facility the way that you want it to be, I'm going to need more information. And that's when I've seen the other MBRs, which are much more detailed and informative. They tend to give me more insight, and they tend to reduce the number of back and forward that I need from them as well in order to complete. So it's, again, there is no strict way of doing these things. It's up to preference. And a lot of people will say, hey, that's great. But, for me today, when I operate, I don't want to carry 50 pages with me. I want 10 pages. I write my information. I'm all good. Right. But I still see the value of, even if my operators know everything, I know one guy is going to leave perhaps, and another guy might come in tomorrow. So I want the new person to get a document that doesn't treat him like a seasoned operator, right? I want him to feel comfortable with what he has, and I don't want him to make any presumptions. So I'm going to put XYZ controls into place by detailing out a few more things that I don't need to detail, but I feel it's a nice to have for you. So I would then author it that way.
So yeah, what I'm hearing from that story is like the context. It's almost acting as like an insurance for when the actual operator may move on and you got a new one. If the previous one knows how to do it, great. But you don't want to have to figure out on the spot when a new person comes in. You don't want to have to fill in those cracks at the end.
Absolutely. And in that situation, I would perhaps have to overtrain an individual or train someone more than I would have to normally if they want to kind of perform that or execute that batch record the way that the previous operator had, right? So again, I'm wasting time and effort. And if I had a good document, and you're never going to eliminate training, but there is a level of training that you can reduce if you have a document that's a little more detailed out.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's been a super informative episode. So thank you, Akshay.
Thank you. Yeah. I enjoyed it as well. So thank you for having me on the podcast. Yeah.